The setting sun cast a golden hue over Lakeview City as Rebecca Carter, the newly appointed chief of police at Brookfield Precinct, drove home. Rebecca, a black woman with a commanding presence, was Lakeview's first black police chief. Her appointment was a victory, not just for her, but for a community that had long struggled with racial tensions. Rebecca's mind was on the reforms she planned to implement when flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Startled, she checked her speed. It was well within the limit. Confused, she pulled over. Two white officers emerged, their steps deliberate. She sensed a familiar tension, one that seemed more about her presence than any real infraction. The taller officer, Officer Blake, knocked on her window, his tone dismissive as he demanded license and registration. "Ma'am." She handed over her documents without a word, observing his reaction as he looked them over. His partner, Officer Turner, stood back, watching the scene unfold. "What are you doing in this part of town?" Blake asked, his tone laced with condescension. "I live nearby," Rebecca replied calmly. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," Turner added, his eyes scanning her face. She recognized this tactic, an attempt to intimidate. She thought briefly about revealing her identity, but decided to let them proceed. Observing their behavior, Blake leaned closer, voice insistent. "Step out of the vehicle." "Ma'am." Rebecca held his gaze, an ironic smile forming. "Do you know who I am?" The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Blake replied, "Should I?" Rebecca let the silence stretch before she replied, "I'm Rebecca Carter, your new chief of police." Their postures stiffened as her words registered. Blake scrambled to recover. "Well, Chief, we were just following procedure." Her smile vanished. "Is that so? Because I don't recall any directives about pulling drivers over without cause." Her tone was firm, underscoring her authority. The officers, once full of confidence, now looked deflated as the gravity of their actions sank in. The silence that followed Rebecca's revelation was thick with tension. Officer Blake, who had projected such confidence moments before, now stood frozen. Uncertainty etched across his face. His partner, Officer Turner, shifted uncomfortably, glancing away as though he wished to disappear. Rebecca held their gaze, letting the weight of her words linger. She could see the gears turning in their heads, trying to process the reality of their error. Blake's earlier bravado was now gone, replaced with a tentative, almost pleading look as he attempted to regain some sense of control. "Chief Carter," he finally said, his voice losing its earlier edge. We were just trying to be thorough. You thought you'd pulled over someone who didn't belong here." Rebecca cut him off, her tone measured but sharp. "Tell me, Officer Blake, what made you think I was suspicious?" Blake opened his mouth, but no words came. Turner, attempting to salvage the situation, spoke up, his tone quiet. "Chief, we had no idea it was you. If we had known, Rebecca's gaze hardened. "If you had known, this stop would never have happened." "That's precisely the problem." Turner swallowed. His confidence evaporated. "We didn't mean any harm, Chief." Rebecca took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You approach me based on an assumption, one rooted not in fact but in bias. This is not how we operate in my precinct, nor how we serve this community." Her voice, though calm, held a firm resolve that neither officer could ignore. Both men shifted, visibly humbled, and finally nodded in silent acknowledgement. The usual authority they carried with their uniforms seemed to melt away. Rebecca glanced toward the horizon, the last light of the day fading, then looked back at the officers. "Today, you made an error in judgment," she continued, her tone now softer but no less authoritative. "But I believe everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. I expect both of you to be part of the solution going forward." "Understood." "Yes, Chief," both men replied, barely above a whisper. Rebecca gave a nod and got back into her car, leaving the officers to reflect on the lesson she'd delivered. As she pulled away, she felt a mix of frustration and resolve. This encounter had revealed much about the work ahead. There would be resistance, but she was more determined than ever to see her precinct transformed into a place where everyone, regardless of background, would be treated with respect. The following morning, Rebecca arrived at the Brookfield precinct, her mind still on the previous evening's encounter. She'd hoped her appointment would signal a new era, but last night's experience was a reminder of the work that lay ahead. The precinct was bustling as usual, officers preparing for their shifts, and Rebecca could feel the buzz that followed her as she walked through the hallway. News of the encounter had spread quickly, stirring conversations and speculation among her team. Inside her office, Rebecca sat across from Lieutenant Sarah Lopez, her trusted second-in-command. Sarah had been with the precinct for years and had witnessed her fair share of tension and division among the officers. A Latina woman who had faced her own battles in law enforcement. She was one of the few whom Rebecca trusted completely. I heard about what happened with Officers Blake and Turner. Sarah began, glancing up from her notes. They're rattled. Honestly, it might have been the first time they realized the weight of their own actions. Rebecca nodded, her expression thoughtful. It was a lesson they needed, but it's only a start. The mindset around here needs to shift. Sarah, this isn't just about one or two officers. It's the entire culture. Sarah's expression softened, a quiet understanding between them. You're right, but there's resistance. Rebecca, some of the old guard, especially Sergeant Collins, think the precinct doesn't need change. They're not saying it outright, but they're not shy about showing it. Rebecca let out a sigh. She had anticipated opposition, but knew that Collins, a seasoned sergeant with decades on the force, wielded considerable influence among the more conservative officers. She'd already sensed his unease about her appointment, but hearing it confirmed added weight to her task. Change isn't easy, Rebecca replied, leaning forward. But that's why I'm here. We're implementing mandatory bias training next month, and I'll be starting community outreach initiatives to address the tensions between our officers and the public. Collins and others can disagree, but they'll need to adapt or make room for those who will. Sarah nodded in agreement, but her eyes held a flicker of worry. I stand with you, Rebecca, but you know Collins isn't the type to back down without a fight. He's been here a long time and believes he knows what's best for Brookfield. I expected that, Rebecca said, her voice firm. And I'm prepared. This isn't about anyone's comfort. It's about making sure this precinct serves and protects all of Lakeview, not just those who look a certain way. Just then, a soft knock interrupted them. An Officer Ramirez, a young patrol officer, stepped inside. He handed Rebecca a small envelope, his expression tense. Chief, I found this on my desk this morning. I think you should see it. Rebecca took the envelope, unfolding a note with bold, hastily scrawled handwriting. Traitors don't belong here. Watch your back. The words were chilling, but Rebecca's face remained unreadable. She folded the note, slipping it back into the envelope before addressing Sarah and Ramirez, who looked visibly disturbed. Thank you, Ramirez. I'll take it from here, she said calmly. As he left, Sarah leaned in, her tone urgent. This is serious. Rebecca, this isn't just resistance. It's a threat. Rebecca met her gaze, her expression unwavering. I knew this job wouldn't be easy, and I didn't come here to be intimidated. They may try to frighten me, but I'm not backing down. Sarah nodded, resolute. Let me know how I could support you. We're in this together. Rebecca knew she would need allies like Sarah to navigate the coming storms. But she was undeterred. The note, though unsettling, had only strengthened her resolve. She was here to lead and to fight for real change, no matter the challenges or the threats. The road ahead would be tough, but Rebecca Carter had never been one to turn away from a challenge. Rebecca paced her office later that afternoon, her gaze flickering to the note lying on her desk. She knew the warning wouldn't be the last. The threat itself wasn't what concerned her most. It was the realization that some within her department were willing to undermine her, even at the cost of the precinct's integrity. She felt the weight of her position more than ever, knowing that her every decision would be met with scrutiny and, for some, open hostility. A soft knock on her door broke her train of thought. It was Lieutenant Sarah Lopez again, her expression grave. "Rebecca," she began quietly, "I did a little more digging on Collins. He's been meeting off-site with some of the senior officers, mostly those who've been around for decades. It's not just idle talk. They're actively strategizing against you." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Collins has more influence than I thought," she said. "But I won't let him jeopardize what we're trying to build here." Sarah nodded. "There's more," she continued. "Some of these officers see your reforms as a threat to the way things are done. They don't want to lose control, and they see you as an outsider, someone who threatens their authority." Rebecca sat silently for a moment, weighing her options. Confronting Collins directly could push him to be even more defiant, but leaving him unchecked would allow dissent to fester. After a moment, she looked back at Sarah with a determined expression. "Bring Collins to my office," she instructed, her voice calm but resolute. "It's time he and I had a clear conversation." A few minutes later, Sarah returned with Sergeant Collins in tow. He entered Rebecca's office with a stiff posture and an air of quiet defiance. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. "Sergeant Collins," Rebecca began, her tone neutral, "I'm aware that you and several others have concerns about my approach to reform here at Brookfield. I wanted to address this directly rather than let grievances simmer." Collins crossed his arms, his gaze hard. "With all due respect, Chief Carter, some of us believe these changes you're pushing through aren't in the best interests of the precinct. We kept things running here for years. These new policies, these community outreach programs, they're just going to make us look weak." Rebecca held his gaze, refusing to let his tone shake her. "Weakness isn't the issue here, Collins. Accountability is. You may see these reforms as an inconvenience, but they're necessary to rebuild trust with the community and address the underlying issues that have plagued this department." Collins scoffed slightly, clearly unimpressed. "We're here to keep the peace, not to cater to every demand from people who don't understand what we deal with every day." Rebecca's eyes hardened. "And how is undermining my leadership helping to keep the peace? How is it helping this precinct if there's no unity within our own team?" Collins looked momentarily taken aback, his stance shifting. "Chief, we're just doing what we believe is right." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice steady. "If you believe that actively working against me is what's right, you're free to leave, Collins. But make no mistake, if you stay, you'll follow my lead, and that means supporting these changes, not sabotaging them." Collins bristled, but remained silent, his face a mask of restrained anger. He nodded curtly, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than agreement. Rebecca dismissed him with a steady gaze, watching as he turned and left without another word. When Sarah closed the door behind him, she looked at Rebecca with a faint smile. "He's not going to like this." Rebecca exhaled, her focus sharpened. "He doesn't have to like it. He just has to comply." But as she watched Collins leave, Rebecca knew this was only the beginning. She'd stirred up resistance in the heart of the precinct, and those who resisted would likely only dig in deeper. But she was ready. For Rebecca Carter, leadership wasn't about popularity, it was about conviction, and she wasn't about to let anyone, not even a veteran like Collins, stand in the way of her vision for Brookfield. The following day, Rebecca sat at the long conference table in the precinct's community room, preparing for a meeting that she knew would be pivotal. She had invited several community leaders to discuss her new initiatives and address their concerns, hoping to build a bridge between the Brookfield precinct and the people it served. Among the attendees were Jasmine Reed, a local activist known for her fierce dedication to civil rights, and Pastor Wallace, a respected figure in the neighborhood. Lieutenant Sarah Lopez stood beside her, flipping through her notes. "Everyone's here, Chief," she said quietly. "They're eager to hear what you have to say, but they're also skeptical. This precinct has let them down for years." Rebecca nodded. She knew that gaining the trust of the community wouldn't be easy. Many residents had lost faith in the police, and with good reason. But Rebecca was determined to show them that change was possible, and that she was serious about creating a safer, more inclusive Lakeview. As she rose to address the room, the conversation died down, all eyes turning to her. "Thank you all for being here," Rebecca began, her voice steady. I know that this community has a complicated relationship with the police, and I understand that trust has been broken in the past. But I'm here to change that. Today, I want to outline some of the steps we're taking to make sure this precinct serves you with integrity and respect. Jasmine Reed crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. With all due respect, Chief Carter, we've heard promises like this before. How can we know that this time it's real? Rebecca took a breath. She had anticipated Jasmine's skepticism. I don't expect you to believe me based on words alone, she replied. Actions speak louder. That's why we're implementing mandatory bias training for all officers, starting immediately. This isn't a one-time seminar. It's a comprehensive program that every officer will complete regularly. I'm also setting up a community oversight board, which will include voices from your neighborhoods. This board will have real power to review incidents and suggest disciplinary actions if needed. The room stirred with interest, though there were still wary expressions. Pastor Wallace spoke up, his voice calm but firm. An oversight board sounds promising, but we've seen boards like this created before, only to have them rendered powerless by red tape and resistance. How can you ensure this one will make a difference? Rebecca met his gaze directly. This board will work directly with me, and I'll be transparent about its findings. There will be no barriers or secrecy. I am committed to transparency, and I want the community to hold us accountable. A young activist, Malik, leaned forward. You talk about accountability, but what about the officers who are still on the force after years of misconduct? They're the ones who need to go if anything's really going to change. Rebecca's tone sharpened slightly as she replied, I understand, and any officers who can't adapt to the new standards will not be welcome here. Recent complaints are being reviewed, and any officer found to have violated our policies will face consequences. The room quieted, the weight of her words settling in. Jasmine regarded Rebecca with a faint nod of acknowledgement, though her eyes still held questions. We want to believe you, Chief Carter, but you have to understand that we're tired. We're tired of being seen as problems in our own neighborhoods. Rebecca's gaze softened, and I'm here to change that. I want this precinct to serve as a partner to the community, not an adversary. But to make that happen, I need your support. Let's work together to build a safer, more respectful Lakeview. After a pause, Jasmine extended a tentative hand, which Rebecca shook firmly. We'll hold you to that, Chief, Jasmine said, a note of determination in her voice. As the meeting wrapped up, Rebecca felt a surge of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but she had taken a critical first step. Winning over the community would take time, but she was prepared to earn their trust one action at a time. In the days following her meeting with the community, Rebecca felt a renewed sense of purpose. The conversation with leaders like Jasmine and Pastor Wallace had reassured her that, despite the challenges, there was potential for a real partnership between the precinct and the community. However, she knew that trust was a fragile thing, easily shaken by missteps. And soon, that fragility would be tested. Late one afternoon, as Rebecca was wrapping up a day's work, Lieutenant Sarah Lopez entered her office, a look of concern on her face. Chief, we have a situation, she began, holding up a police report. There was an incident last night involving one of our patrols. It looks like excessive force was used during an arrest in the East District. Rebecca's expression tightened. The East District was one of Lakeview's more sensitive areas, where tensions between the police and residents ran high. Who was involved? She asked, already bracing herself. Sarah hesitated. It was Sergeant Collins' unit. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Collins, the seasoned officer who had already made his opposition to her reforms clear, was now at the center of an incident that could undermine everything she'd been working toward. Do we have details? Rebecca pressed, keeping her tone controlled. Sarah nodded, passing over the report. Witnesses say Collins and his team responded to a suspected break-in. When they arrived, they encountered a young man, unarmed. From what we've gathered, things escalated quickly, and it sounds like Collins used force that was questionable, to say the least. Rebecca read through the report, each line sparking a mix of frustration and disbelief. Collins knew the spotlight was on us, she murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. And yet, he did this anyway. Do you think he's trying to undermine you? Chief, Sarah asked, her voice laced with worry. It feels deliberate. Rebecca took a deep breath. She knew that Collins' resistance to her leadership ran deep, but she hadn't anticipated that he would go so far as to jeopardize public trust. Whether it's deliberate or not, this needs to be addressed immediately, she replied. If we let this go unchecked, it will send the wrong message to the community and the entire department. That evening, Rebecca sat alone in her office, grappling with the implications of the incident. She knew the community would demand answers, and rightfully so. The trust she had started to build was now at risk, and Collins' actions had set back her progress. But as much as she felt anger and disappointment, she also felt a renewed resolve. Collins' behavior only confirmed the need for her reforms. If he wanted to test her resolve, she was prepared to show him and everyone else that she would not be easily deterred. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Rebecca began drafting a statement to the community and an official response for her team. She knew that her words needed to strike a balance between accountability and commitment to change. This was not just a setback, it was a test of her leadership. By the time she left the precinct that night, she was more determined than ever to stay the course. This incident might shake the foundations of her reform efforts. But Rebecca Carter was not about to let the actions of one officer define her vision for the future. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the precinct to find a group of protesters gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for our neighborhoods and accountability now." Word of Collins' actions had spread quickly, and community anger was palpable. She saw familiar faces among the crowd: Jasmine Reed, Pastor Wallace, and even Malik, the young activist. Their eyes were fierce, and their demands for justice unyielding. Inside, Lieutenant Sarah Lopez waited for her, her face tense. The community wants answers. Chief, they're calling for Collins' suspension and a full investigation. Rebecca nodded, the gravity of the moment weighing on her. They're right to be upset. I'll address the crowd and make it clear we're taking this seriously. Sarah's eyes softened with encouragement. We're behind you, Chief. This is why you're here, to lead through moments like this. Taking a steadying breath, Rebecca stepped outside to face the crowd. As she approached, the chanting quieted, replaced by an expectant silence. She met Jasmine's gaze, and in that look, she saw the weight of years of mistrust. She raised her voice, clear and steady. Thank you all for coming, she began. I know many of you are angry, and rightfully so. Last night, there was an incident involving one of our officers. I want you to know that I am fully aware of what happened, and I am here to ensure that justice is served. Jasmine's voice rang out from the crowd. What will you do about Collins? He can't keep abusing his authority while you talk about reforms. Rebecca didn't flinch. Sergeant Collins has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. I'm working closely with our oversight board to review his actions thoroughly. If it's found that he violated department policies or used excessive force, there will be consequences. The crowd murmured, both surprised and reassured by her decisive tone. Pastor Wallace stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. Chief Carter, we appreciate your transparency, but we need more than just promises. We need to see action and change. Rebecca nodded, acknowledging his words. I understand. This incident shows how much work remains to be done, and it reinforces my commitment to reform. I'm here to build a department that truly serves and respects every member of this community. I ask for your patience, but more importantly, I ask for your partnership. We can only achieve this together. After a moment's pause, Malik, the young activist, spoke up. We'll be watching. Chief, don't let us down. Rebecca met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. I won't. As she turned to re-enter the precinct, Rebecca felt the weight of the community's expectations pressing upon her. They had trusted her enough to give her a chance, and she was determined not to squander it. She knew that her journey as chief would be filled with challenges. But today had proven something vital. The community was willing to stand by her, if she proved worthy of their trust. Inside, Sarah gave her a nod of approval. That was powerful. Rebecca, they needed to hear it from you. Rebecca managed a small smile. They deserved it. And now we make sure those words are backed by actions. Let's begin the investigation into Collins and hold him accountable. With her team's support and the community watching closely, Rebecca was ready to face whatever came next. This was the moment to prove that change, while difficult, was indeed possible, and that no one, not even a seasoned sergeant, was above the values she was bringing to Brookfield. As the investigation into Collins proceeded, Rebecca knew it was essential to address the entire department. She had already seen how deeply divided her team was on issues of reform, and Collins' actions had only intensified the rift. To lead effectively, she needed everyone to understand that there was no room for resistance against the changes she was implementing. That afternoon, she called a department-wide meeting in the precinct's briefing room. The officers filed in, some with expressions of curiosity, others with wary skepticism. She could feel the tension, especially among the older officers who had long followed Collins' lead. When the room quieted, Rebecca stood before her team, her gaze steady and unyielding. Thank you all for being here. I know that recent events have stirred up a lot of emotions, and there's been concern about the direction of this precinct. She paused, letting her words settle. I want to be clear. What happened with Sergeant Collins is unacceptable. As police officers, our duty is to protect and serve this community with integrity, not to instill fear or mistrust. An investigation is underway, and I promise full transparency. But let me be unequivocal. This department will no longer tolerate misconduct, nor will it shield those who abuse their authority. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, casting quick glances at each other. Rebecca recognized the subtle discontent and knew she needed to address it head-on. I understand that for some of you, these changes may feel uncomfortable. You've been doing things a certain way for years, and maybe you don't see why things need to change. But I'm here to tell you that change is not optional. Our responsibility is to earn the trust of the people we serve. And if that means doing things differently, then that's what we will do. Sergeant Collins, who had been placed on administrative leave but attended the meeting out of protocol, looked away, his expression hard. Rebecca met his gaze for a moment, allowing her own resolve to show. You have a choice, she continued, addressing the room. You can choose to be part of this transformation, to work alongside me and help rebuild the relationship between our precinct and the community. Or, if you find that this mission doesn't align with your values, you are free to leave. The room was silent. Rebecca could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, challenging each officer to examine their own principles. Finally, Officer Ramirez, a young patrol officer who had been quietly supportive, raised his voice. Chief, I'm with you. I joined this force to serve the community, and I believe that change is the only way forward. A few more voices murmured in agreement, breaking the silence. Rebecca felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight, but she also knew that there were others, like Collins, who wouldn't change easily. She nodded toward Ramirez. Thank you. I need officers like you, those willing to look at the bigger picture and uphold the true values of our duty. As the meeting adjourned, officers filed out, some with newfound resolve, others visibly displeased. Rebecca remained behind, watching as Collins lingered near the door, his posture tense. Something on your mind? Sergeant, she asked calmly. He met her gaze, his tone stiff. I just hope you know what you're doing. Chief, not everyone is on board with this new direction. Rebecca's response was firm but measured. I don't need everyone to agree with me. Collins, I need them to respect the standards of this precinct. And if they can't, they're welcome to find work elsewhere. Collins held her gaze, but there was a hint of resignation in his eyes. He turned and left without another word. Rebecca exhaled, feeling the strain of the day. She knew the path ahead would be steep, but today had shown her something vital. With allies like Ramirez and the support of the community, she had the foundation needed to move forward. And no matter the resistance, she was ready to see her mission through. The days following the department meeting were tense. while some officers, like Officer Ramirez, stood by Rebecca's side. Others seemed to simmer with discontent. Rebecca could feel the subtle resistance in the air, but she refused to let it shake her resolve. The changes she had set in motion were bigger than any individual officer's comfort or preferences. She spent the next several days meeting with various officers, trying to gauge where they stood and whether they were truly on board with the reforms. Sergeant Collins, though on leave, remained an ever-present shadow, his influence palpable. Even from a distance, Rebecca knew that dealing with him directly was inevitable. His resistance to her leadership wasn't just about a few reforms. It was about his vision for the precinct, a vision that clashed with hers at its core. One afternoon, as Rebecca sat in her office reviewing the results of the internal investigation into Collins, Lieutenant Sarah Lopez knocked and entered, her expression unreadable. She placed a file on Rebecca's desk. "Chief, we got a problem," Sarah said, her voice low. Rebecca's heart sank. "What now?" Sarah gestured to the file. "It's about the protest from last week. There's a report of some of our officers, Collins' group, intimidating protesters outside the precinct." Rebecca's jaw clenched as she opened the file. The allegations were serious. Officers were accused of using their authority to push back against peaceful protesters, making threats, and attempting to escalate the situation. The most troubling part? It was clear that Sergeant Collins was involved, either directly or indirectly. Rebecca stood, pacing across the room as the weight of the situation settled in. She had already given Collins a chance to correct his behavior and had promised accountability. But now his actions were escalating. This wasn't just about insubordination anymore. This was undermining the very trust the precinct was trying to rebuild. "Collins needs to be removed from his position," Rebecca said finally, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "This is no longer about reforming his behavior. It's about sending a message to the entire department that this kind of conduct won't be tolerated." Sarah nodded in agreement, though her expression showed the same concern that Rebecca felt. "It'll be a challenge. Collins has been here too long, and there are some who will follow him. The resistance is only going to grow from here." Rebecca paused, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "Then we'll face it head on. I'll call him in tomorrow. He'll know exactly why he's being removed. And the rest of the department will understand that no one is above the changes we're making." The next day, as Collins walked into Rebecca's office, the air felt thick with unspoken tension. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. His face was grim, his posture defensive. "Sergeant Collins," Rebecca began, her voice firm but not unkind. "I've reviewed the reports, and I've spoken with the community leaders. Your behavior outside the precinct during last week's protest was unacceptable. This is not the conduct I expect from anyone in this department." Collins stood tall, but didn't respond immediately. He knew what was coming, but was unwilling to concede without a fight. "With all due respect, Chief, I was just doing my job." "The protesters." "I don't care what the protesters did," Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. "What matters is how you responded. The fact that you used your position to intimidate citizens and escalate an already tense situation is a direct violation of our policies. I'm afraid I can no longer allow you to serve in this capacity." Collins' eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. Rebecca could see the anger rising in him, but she remained unyielding. This wasn't personal. It was about maintaining integrity within the precinct and with the community. "Effective immediately. You're being reassigned," Rebecca continued. "You will be placed on administrative leave, pending further review. I'll have you escorted out of the building once we're done here." Collins didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, it was with a cold edge. "You'll regret this. Carter, you've got no idea what you're up against." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "If that's how you feel, Sergeant, then perhaps this department isn't the right place for you. I've been appointed to lead, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, no matter who stands in my way." Collins gritted his teeth, clearly seething. With a curt nod, he turned and walked out of the office, his steps heavy with defiance. But as the door closed behind him, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The decision hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. She had just made it clear that the era of unchecked power in Brookfield was over. As word spread through the precinct that Collins had been removed from his position, Rebecca was both relieved and nervous. She knew that some would view this as a victory for reform, while others would see it as an attack on their way of doing things. But for Rebecca, the important thing was that she had acted decisively, showing that there was no room for officers who would actively undermine her leadership or betray the trust of the community. Now, more than ever, she needed the support of her officers, especially those like Officer Ramirez who had been vocal in their backing of the changes. She had one more fight ahead of her, to rebuild the fractured precinct and lead them into a new era of accountability and service. It wasn't going to be easy, but Rebecca Carter wasn't backing down. After Sergeant Collins' removal, Rebecca felt the weight of the ongoing tension in the precinct. While some officers supported her reforms, others resisted. The challenge ahead was not just about removing bad actors, but changing the culture of the entire department. Rebecca addressed the community, acknowledging the recent mistakes and outlining new reforms: mandatory bias training, an independent oversight board, and greater community engagement. The protest grew larger, but her words resonated, especially when she confirmed Collins' removal and ongoing investigation. Weeks passed, and Rebecca's reforms began to take shape. The oversight board was active, bias training progressed, and Rebecca personally led the charge for change. Tensions remained, but progress was clear. One day, Jasmine Reed called Rebecca to express cautious support. Acknowledging her efforts, Rebecca, though aware that much work remained, knew that this moment marked the beginning of true reform. The road ahead was long, but Rebecca had proven that change was possible, and she wasn't backing down.